summer before I went off to seminary, I had a job that occasionally involved commuting late at night. Now, you may recall that in the days before satellite radio and podcasts, there was precious little to listen to on the radio at that hour. Precious little. So one evening, as I was twisting the dial back and forth, desperately seeking something to keep me awake, I stumbled on a station way down towards the lower end of the dial that caught my interest. There was a narrator with one of those deep radio voices, telling a story about some down-on-his-luck guy whose life had completely fallen apart. There was booze involved, and adultery, and divorce, and estrangement from his kids, and a repossessed car, and getting fired from his job, and on it went in a way that would have made even a country music song blush. But I took the bait, and before I knew it, they had me hook, line, and sinker. I just had to find out how it would all turn out. Would he turn his life around, or would he continue down the road to perdition? So I kept listening. It turns out I'd found an old-timey Christian radio show called Unshackled. The show told dramatized, allegedly true stories of profound spiritual transformation interspersed with cheesy organ music in the Saved by Jesus style of a Billy Graham crusade. The program first aired in 1950 from the Pacific Garden Mission in Chicago, Illinois, as the announcer would always say, and it has been one of the longest running shows in radio history, the stated purpose of which was to prove that Christ can break the fetters of sin and set the sinner free. This approach to faith, this emphasis on egregious sin and personal salvation, was not exactly in line with my experience growing up in a suburban Episcopal congregation in leafy North Baltimore. I didn't know anyone at church who had dramatically turned his life over to Jesus after a visit from the repo man. Didn't. Now, there were plenty of people who wanted to be drawn deeper into relationship with Jesus Christ, who wanted to live out their faith by making a difference in the world. But there weren't a ton of folks with wildly dramatic stories of conversion, of being utterly lost and then wonderfully found by God. And if there were, in true Episcopal fashion, they would have kept it to themselves. They certainly weren't going to be going onto a radio program to share their story. But that's exactly what we get in the parable of the prodigal son. It's from this story that we get that line from Amazing Grace: I once was lost and now am found, was blind but now I see. The younger son's entire life could have been featured on an episode of Unshackled. The dissolute and sinful living, trying to fill a void with wine, women, and song, being so hungry that even the pigs were eating better food than he was, the rock bottom of shame and despair, until that moment of clarity when his heart turns. When he says to himself, I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. I think for those of us whose faith never involved such drama, we often feel just a little bit left out when we hear stories like the ones featured on Unshackled or the parable of the prodigal son. If you grew up in a more evangelical tradition, there's some real pressure to point to a specific moment when you got saved, to be able to share a dramatic conversion experience that allowed you to give your life over to Jesus. But there's less of an emphasis on testimonies of personal salvation in our tradition. No one gets too excited when you tell them that you came to Christ by going to church with your parents. It's not nearly as exciting as a foxhole conversion experience or seeing the light after battling a gambling addiction. No producer is going to put you on the radio if you say that you found God at coffee hour. But just because you may not have seen a blinding light, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, or had a prodigal son, once was lost, now is found experience, our daily interactions with the risen Christ are no less dramatic. Sometimes Jesus speaks to us through bold and spectacular events, yes. But more often he speaks to us through the gentle stirrings of the heart, through daily interactions with others, through the kindness of friends, through a moment of quiet contemplation after receiving communion. You could say that the entire life of faith, starting with our baptism, consists of a rhythm of falling away and returning to God, of being lost and being found. You can look at the whole span of your life and point to those moments, those periods when you have felt particularly distant from God, and those moments when you have felt particularly close to God. But I'm also convinced that every time we fall away from God, which we do daily in ways big and small, but every time we turn away from God, we can return to that amazing, grace-filled moment when the prodigal son's forgiving father races out to greet him. He doesn't just wait for his youngest son to trudge slowly up that long driveway. And by the way, you can imagine how hard this journey must have been for him. He probably spent the whole time rehearsing his apology in his head, full of shame, not knowing whether he would be even welcome in his father's house. But the moment the son turns back towards him, the father runs out to greet him with arms wide open to embrace him and welcome him home. The thing is, God's welcome is not a passive welcome. Yes, God waits patiently for you to turn back towards him when you fall away. But the moment you do, the moment you turn towards God, even slightly, even hesitantly, even haltingly, God runs out to embrace you, to enfold you in his loving arms, to welcome you home. And that, my friends, is the amazing grace we're always singing about. This grace that is never transactional or provisional, but always absolute and unconditional. You may or may not be able to relate to Unshackled's dramatic conversion stories, but when you invite Jesus into your life, when you turn your life over to him, when you pray regularly and crack open your Bible frequently and worship God weekly, you will experience a daily conversion of the heart. And that's how your life is transformed by God. By the God who created you and loves you and continually seeks to welcome you home.